This week we are talking about the early theories of counseling. And the two people that we're covering this week are Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler. Most of the people who are in psychology or counseling know those two names. And so are very familiar a lot of times with the basic ideas of Freud and Adler. They were not the earliest of theorists, even though Sigmund Freud a lot of times is described as the father or the grandfather of psychotherapy. There were others that were working as well. A group of people, among them Pierre Genet, that's talked about in our textbook, was in France and doing some of the similar work in psychotherapy, while Freud and Adler and others were working in Germany and Vienna. But this week we talk about Freud and Adler. Freud and Adler actually had some collegial interaction early on in their careers. Sigmund Freud founded a group that was originally called a Wednesday Psychology Group, or a Wednesday Psychological Society. It later became the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. And Alfred Adler was a part of that. Adler, we're not sure in the history of how Adler and Freud kind of became at least interactive as colleagues, even though they had very different and disparate ideas about psychotherapy and the development of people. A lot of people describe Adler as a protege of Freud, which he was not. He never was. Adler was actually disgruntled when people would say that, and history says that Adler actually carried around a little card that was sent to him by Freud inviting him to the Wednesday Psychological Society as a colleague and not a protege. In fact, Adler and Jung, who were initially part of that Vienna Society, ended up kind of being estranged from the society. And Adler was actually voted out as the president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, I think in about 1910, 1911. And so Freud always wanted his ideas to be prevalent, and he believed that they were the correct perspective on humanity and psychology, the development of the personality, and the problems that develop in personality, and then how we ultimately address those in psychotherapy. And I still think that today there's some good things that we can take, at least understanding people somewhat and the complexity of humanity from Sigmund Freud. Most of what he believed about psychosexual development that's described in our textbook has pretty much been dismissed by people. The newer models of psychoanalysis or psychodynamic psychotherapy have tended to move away from that focus on the psychosexual stages. But for the time in thinking about how Sigmund Freud put the personality together, we need to understand that a lot of it for these early guys was always based on their own experience. So when you read the history of Sigmund Freud in his family and kind of understand some of the dynamics of his family, as well as when we read about Adler, you will see that a lot of their understanding about humanity and about their ultimately what fed into their theories came from their early personal experiences in their life. And so we take a lot from that as we think about this. Freud really focused on three things that you will see in the textbook, and the levels of consciousness, those things of which we are conscious and aware, those things that are in the preconscious, as he calls it, that we tend to be unaware of, but are easily to recall when you think about it. And then, as he described it, all of those things that are unconscious. When you see what Freud described a lot of times with the unconscious level of material, you will see it somewhat described as an iceberg. And a lot of times it is pictured as an iceberg in a textbook. And what the way that diagram is explained is that when you see the iceberg, the part of the iceberg that you see on the surface is very little, and then typically underneath is the largest amount of the iceberg. And that's exactly the way Sigmund Freud described the human personality, and the way our personality works is that the part that is conscious to us and aware to us tends to be the smallest part, and the part that is underneath, that unconscious part, which is totally out of our awareness, is unavailable to us. But because it is the largest part of our inner workings, then those things are what drive us. And he talked about the id, the ego, and the superego as mechanisms of our personality, and the three parts of our personality. And so ultimately for Freud, and this is putting it rather simplistically, he basically said those things that drive us and control us in terms of psychological problems, the anxieties that we have, the neuroses is the term that used to be used. We don't hear that much anymore. Those things are tied to conflicts and fixations or troubles and difficulties in the formation of our personality from a young age. One of the things that Freud said was he believed that our basic personality structure was in place by the time we were about 5 or 6. And a lot of people still kind of hold to that idea that the fundamental personality structure that we're going to have is developed by the time we're 5 or 6. And Freud even says that because of that, once we get to people later in life, most of the time, that it is very difficult to change, restructure, and transform the basic core personality that a person has, because it tends to be in place, and the foundation for it is going to be very difficult to change beyond that early life. And I would tend to kind of agree with that those experiences and those things that we see with people make it very, very difficult to really get to the deepest structure of fundamentally changing a person when their personality, particularly, we see evidences of severe kinds of things like personality disorders. And those kinds of disorders and dysfunctions that we see today. Not impossible, but certainly very, very difficult. So he said because all of that material tends to be unconscious, and that is where the psychological conflicts occur, then we have to have a way to get to that unconscious material. And so pretty much all of the things that Freud did in his techniques for psychotherapy were things that got at that unconscious material, whether it was word association, dream interpretations. One of the earliest books that he wrote was this book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And I love to kind of reference this and see some of the early things that Freud wrote about. And a few years ago, I kind of got interested because of courses like this and reading more about Freud, though I don't believe a lot of what he said was very relevant. But I think it's important. Also, he developed the defense mechanisms. He and his daughter, Anna, really fundamentally helped identify those. And I still think they're relevant today when we look at those defense mechanisms. And also some of the newer therapies. One of the things that I talk about a lot and I do like is emotionally focused therapy. which comes from psychoanalysis. And it is based a lot on interactive love and attachment and bonding, and I think that's very important. The work of John Bowlby in attachment theory, I think, is still important in our world today. So as we see these things, we certainly know that they're still important today. That in terms of Freudian ideas, even though Freud did not define it, I think he lays out a part of how we are in terms of the image of God. And I believe one of the most important things for those of us who want to look at counseling as with a Christian worldview, that understanding the biblical anthropological idea of the image and likeness of God is very important. And that really relates to integration, I think, particularly true and important, because we need to understand what the Bible means when it talks about how we are put together. And while Freud didn't identify that in a biblical standard or biblical concept of the id, the ego, and the superego, I certainly think there are connections related to the sin nature that we have with the id, and then other structures that we have that, like the ego, that tends to be the traffic cop to control those things. And then I think even a higher sense of morality that he called the superego. So this week you'll talk about those things as well. The other person we're going to hit on this week is Alfred Adler. I really do like Adlerian psychology, or individual psychology as it has come to be known, and is still practiced by many people today. So I think it is still relevant. There are a lot of people that, among the people that I know with Adlerian, these are still some of the people who are some of the purists in psychotherapy today that follow Adlerian individual psychology premises. Again, a lot of what Adler described is based on his personal experiences in life as a young person and the experiences in life for him. But where Freud talked a lot about early experiences based on psychosexual development, Adler talked about early experiences as formative to us, and sometimes unconscious and out of our awareness, but formative because of our experience and our interpretation of them. Freud was what we would call today probably a cognitive therapist, and a lot of times in textbooks, Adler is described as a cognitive therapist because he believed that as we have these experiences, we give them interpretation. We make a determination about them and about life and how life is going to be. And that becomes the formation of how we see the world and our experience. And so when you get to the techniques in Adlerian, you will see him talking about early life experiences. They talk about our early recollections and things that and experiences that we have. Those are very important. I talked about Pierre Genet before. One of the things that has influenced one of our therapy systems today, EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, is the work of Pierre Genet. Pierre Genet talked about the layering of trauma and how that influences us. And that is a big part of EMDR. And so we have to remember that a lot of these things still play into a lot of our therapy ideas. Certainly the ideas of Adler and cognitive therapy influenced systems family therapy. He focused on our place in our family and birth order. Those things were very important to Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler was also among the most spiritually and religious supportive of the counselor. Some were very hostile. Freud himself was pretty hostile to religion. While Adler was not particularly religious, he certainly respected religion and spirituality. So it certainly makes a lot of his therapy fit